Hey everyone, I wanted to make this quick book review of a novel that I've read a couple times now called Joan is Okay. This was published earlier this year by Penguin Random House by the author Weike Wang. And this is one of those books that went under the radar this year, but I think if you are interested in Asian American literature, this book is definitely one to pick up, read through, and to think about because it brings up a lot of issues that I think are quite important for us younger Chinese Americans, thinking about how the pandemic has kind of shifted the kind of way that we view narratives in our community. So the plot of this novel is pretty straightforward. It's about a millennial ICU doctor who is a Chinese American woman, and I believe that she works at Mount Sinai Morningside, which is a hospital across the street from Columbia in Morningside Heights. And at first, she kind of meets the stereotype of what you'd imagine a socially inept, kind of nerdy Asian American doctor would be like. When she introduces people, she likes to introduce them through their height and their weight. So, for example, on the first page, she introduces a patient as being 5'6" and 290 pounds. So, she's very much someone who likes to categorize people and see them through their quantitative characteristics. One of the reasons why that she likes working in the ICU is that she likes being surrounded by all the ventilators, so machines that she can adjust and manipulate their settings however she wants. She also mentioned somewhere that she likes the ICU because all of her patients are in a coma, and so she doesn't have to talk with them. So all these things that kind of fit the stereotype of an Asian American doctor who is kind of really just in it for financial stability, social recognition. We've all met people like this, and she kind of fits the bill. She'll say things like this, like that sparks, something that only a robot would say. And I think when I first read this book, I was really put off by this kind of language. I thought Weike Wang was very much playing into the stereotype of Asian American inscrutability, something that has a very long tradition in Asian American history, all the way from Tiger Moms in Maxine Hong Kingston's Women Warrior to very like emotionless, inscrutable, very serious Asian men that you see in movies all the time. You see it in A Just Your Life, a book by Chang-Rae Lee. And if you look back at Weike Wang's previous book, this is something that she employs as a way to make good use of her dry humor and her more blunt comedic style of prose. It kind of needs her main characters to be very like deadpan and like unemotional. You see that in her debut novel, Chemistry, where prose is basically identical to Joan is Okay, where the nameless Chinese American narrator is a grad student and she thinks about relationships in terms of rate of change, in terms of chemical catalysts, someone who's very much immersed and internalizes the language of work and the field that they're in. At first I thought, oh, this author is just trying to tell a narrative that would be more legible to non-Asian audiences. This idea that Asian Americans go into medicine because their parents made them, not because they actually want to talk to people and to connect with patients. And even on my second read, I don't think that problem is really redeemable. Although I think I better understand kind of the method that the author is approaching when she wrote this book. So, essentially what I realized was that this novel is kind of like an Asian American retelling of The Stranger, where Joan is kind of like Meursault. People don't really understand her. They don't understand why she is so immersed in work, why, for example, she has no furniture in her apartment building. Basically, her white neighbor, who's kind of like a faux love interest throughout the book, tries to get Joan to have hobbies like reading, for example, watch television. He tries to do all these things to humanize her, to make her more legible to his perspective. And everyone in her workplace does this. All her white coworkers in the hospital, for example, ask her if she's had trauma in the past, intergenerational trauma, as a way to explain why she's such a hardworking doctor. All these things that people try to do to make her legible to them, in the end, just do a sort of violence to her sort of sense of identity. And so this book is very much is trying to be kind of like an existentialist work where it's trying to ask, what if you are a type of person who just loves work and just needs to be completely immersed and exhausted by work to feel like you have meaning in your life? Can this type of person flourish and feel like they belong in a society that's constantly trying to input meaning onto their way of life, especially for Asian Americans, where so much of our modern day lives are informed, or at least supposed to be informed, by past historical traumas of our parents and grandparents. And I think that's also very much where The Stranger comes in, because in The Stranger, Meursault's story really only begins when his mother dies, and he has that reaction where he kind of thinks of it as like a inconvenience rather than as something tragic and emotionally laden. And Joan very much has a similar reaction where she, flies to China to go to the funeral, but people think that it's really weird that she only stays in China for the weekend. And the reason why is because she really wants to go back to work, and she doesn't really process her father's death as something that is super tragic. But it's only when you really start to think about this relationship, or even this relationship with lack of intimacy between Joan and her father, that you kind of understand where she's coming from and how she, in her own way, develops this kind of lexicon of grief that kind of defies what mainstream society tells us, like the way that we should grieve, turning the Meursault narrative around. So instead of murdering someone, this incident of her father dying causes her to reconnect with her cultural heritage, specifically through language, which is very important in this book. I'll give you an example. There's this scene where Joan uses the word chuang with her mom, I believe. And Chinese is something that Weike Wang will sprinkle throughout this book. The narrator is actually very forthcoming when it comes to explaining Chinese words to the reader. Much like Weike Wang herself, the narrator has a really innocent, pure love for the Chinese language. And I think the narrator enjoys explaining things like the word chuang. So in this scene, of course, when her coworkers ask about the word chuang, okay, so I found the section where Joan explains the different words under chuang and what her dad probably could have meant by chuang, because she doesn't really know which of these character meanings is he referring to, and she kind of breaks it down. But basically chuang kind of just means to go forward with something, to keep pushing into the future. And so really that's how Joan learns to reconcile with her father's death, is through these words, through the Chinese language. And I think that's very important to understanding Joan's character, is that very much her way of being is defined by her language. She loves using medical language, things like BMI or ventilator settings, to define other people. Whether or not that's healthy, whether or not that kind of relies on Asian stereotypes, I'll let you decide. Should you buy this book? I think there's a lot to love here. There are some technical problems with this book, like the ending, for example, really quickly introduces the COVID pandemic in like less than 20 pages. It's really rushed. And so technically this book feels like quite incomplete, and I really wish that they had just cut that part off. And there are a lot of other character relationships that are basically completely underdeveloped, like the relationship between Joan and her boss, which is like very cartoonish. Basically all the relationships with all her other coworkers are also very cartoonish and very one-dimensional. So I think that this is an important book, not because this is like the next great Asian American novel or anything, but because it asks us, especially for us who are interested in writing in the Asian American tradition, do we want to keep pushing forward our literature in this vein of stereotypes, Asian Americans as unfeeling, unemotional, robotic, or is it time for us to try to transcend that, even if it means that we become illegible, our characters become illegible to mainstream American audiences? How can you write about Asian American characters that's not just a massive caricature, at the same time being true to the way that we second generation immigrants perceive our parents, which is oftentimes through the lens of stereotypes about Asians? So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that review. A reminder that if you want to purchase this book, please do so through my affiliate link through Bookshop. That not only supports me, but also indie bookstores around the world. Liking and commenting is always helpful. I love to hear if you have read this book before, what were your thoughts on it? And so yeah, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week.